I'm Mary Grove. I used to be a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam Literature Department, and I taught 20th century literature, but my research was on cultural snobbery in the 1930s. And I particularly looked at the hostility to mass education and general reading public by intellectuals in the 30s, which was disgusting. And I took as my sort of first topic for research a really devalued and despised author called Warwick Deeping, who very few people heard of, but he was a kind of synonym for all that was shoddy and low middle class. So a lot of my research was on this disdain and hostility to the mass readership. And then when I left Sheffield about 12 years ago, I thought it is time to actually listen to the people who were despised. And I had my chance in that I got a grant from the church, the Sheffield Town Trust, and they were wonderful. They supported the project right the way through. So I recruited and trained 12 interviewers, and we interviewed over 2 or 3 years, 65 people from Sheffield. And at this point, I need a click. So I can move on to the next slide. I'll just tell you, this little girl comes from Ecclesfield Library, and she was found by my editor at Liverpool University Press, 1957. We know who she is, sort of, but her name is Finer, but we don't know anything more about her. And of course, I'm just always indebted to my editor for finding that, because this is what my book's about. It's about how people made choices in the 30s and the 40s. Very much. Okay, is that better? Can I click on this?
It should be automatically hearing.
Good. And can I move on? Oh, hooray.
Yes,
thank you very much. Okay. So these 65 people were gathered in all sorts of ways. I went round to library groups that the library set up. Mobile and housebound library service were my first source of interviewees. They were wonderful. Libraries have been my allies all the way through, obviously. And then I went round to retirement homes in the city to try and get a geographical spread. And this is not a scientific study, but it is, I hope, representative of Sheffield in the 30s and 40s. And one of these key people was Irene Hailston, who you can see on the right. Her mother, who nurtured her, was almost illiterate, but she valued education, and she supported her daughter, Irene. And she only died last year at the age of 90. And she was a wonderful source of information. So to give you a sense of who the people were that we interviewed, could we click on the next slide? Of the 65 people, the interviewees' fathers came from the following occupational backgrounds. So mining and steel dominated. Then there were 6 people working in retail, fathers working in retail, 13 managers or professionals, and a lot of them worked in mining and steel. And then 7 clerical workers, again, many in mining and 1 in steel. And then 6 could not account for their fathers for one reason or another. And 4 from the wealthy manufacturing classes, 2 of whom came from Ranmore near here, and 2 musicians, and 1 of them was a trumpeter in a colliery band. And then there was a policeman. So they were, I felt, given that it was a pretty serendipitous sort of way of recruiting, it wasn't a bad reflection of the occupational backgrounds of Sheffield at the time. And then next slide, please. Now, the first chapter dealt with my methods and why I came to write the book I did. And it also set the scene of Sheffield as a very unbookish city. And this fascinates me because actually the 65 people we interviewed were compelled to read. It was a sort of inner compulsion in nearly all cases, because Sheffield was not a city. I think probably those of you here who've worked on local history will agree that was not perhaps as open to bookishness as Manchester, Leeds, possibly Birmingham. There wasn't the same number of clerks needed for our particular industries as there was in the textile industries, for example, in Leeds. And I'd love somebody to do a similar project in Leeds, because I think the culture of reading in Leeds will be very different from ours. But because in the 30s or 40s, our readers did not actually see the books were going to get them on in the world, reading became a very private, on the whole, occupation, and a compulsive one. So one of my interviewees, Adele, said, something gets hold of you. And Adele's father was a painter and decorator who despised his daughter when she was reading. And he said, get something in their hands. And so a book was not a thing. It was a distraction, especially for women who were sort of regarded as pudding burners and etc. if they were neglected their domestic tasks, or if they went out to the library, you know, they were tall poppies getting above themselves. So I think women do predominate in this study. I think because they came forward in groups a lot, and I'm sad about that. There were, of those 65, there were only 13 who were men, but in a way they were all the more compulsive, because very few of them worked in trades where books were only help. And some of them, it was never a guilty pleasure. And this is one of the things I loved about our interviewees. They were never guilty about their pleasures, even though they weren't valued highly on the whole. So I looked in my introductory chapter at why I did it. And the second chapter, I take childhood reading, and that's in infancy, when actually children have no agency. They just have the books that turn up in their rooms. And of course, they didn't turn up in their bedrooms. This is one of the things I learned very quickly. As whereas I did read in bed in the 50s and 60s, these children were not allowed to, on the whole, because the bedrooms were cold, and they were not really able, most of them, to do anything when they were in bed except sleep. So if you read in the kitchen on the whole, and of course alongside a load of other people, which kind of intensifies the privacy of it and the personal quality of it. So many of them describe lying behind the sofa, for example, and reading. And so I took, as the structure of my book, stages through a person's life. And then I dealt with the chronological disparities between reading 30s, 40s, 50s within that chapter. So each chapter has a sort of arc, which takes you through those 3 decades. But the whole book takes the stages of reading development. And so the very first chapter was that stage in infancy when you cannot control books you get. And of course, memory here was a very interesting issue, because most of us cannot remember anything before the age of 3.5. Psychologists call it the period of childhood oblivion. And if you were lucky enough to have a parent who valued your reading, they might say, oh, when you were 2, you know, you picked up that. They give you stepping stones into that period of oblivion. And my other great aid in sort of charting their reading histories was annuals. And I've become rather fascinated by annuals, and I couldn't carry any more books in my rucksack, but I have got 20 annuals, all inscribed, which mark a moment in the reader's life. It marks not only as they grew older what they've read, it marks the person who cared about their reading. And so a lot of these annuals are given to our readers by maiden aunts. In the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of women who were unmarried and had a bit of disposable income, and they possibly spent it on their nieces and nephews. So I would say half the inscriptions of the annuals I've got are from aunts. And I find that very touching. And Irene, whom you've seen, went to grammar school, pulled out before her school certificate because she got tuberculosis. Parents felt we couldn't send her for another year, so she never got that school certificate. Quite a common story, as you can imagine. But she never stopped reading, and she read very widely. She loved her annuals. So they are still preserved, and her daughter has them. And when I give a talk, I usually ask Margaret to bring Irene's annuals with me, because they are what Alison Light, I don't know if you've come across Alison Light, whose book The Common People is a wonderful example of writing the history of those who haven't been recorded. She calls them a treasury of biographical objects. And I mean, my house, if you looked at it, is not just a treasury of biographical objects, it's sinking under the weight of biographical objects, I'm afraid. But for some people, animals were the only biographical object, and they were very telling. And they mattered. The fact that they, kept them mattered. So I love annuals and what they tell us. And then gradually, I learned more from what our interviewees could show me, little things. Some of them heirlooms, books from the 19th century they had never read, but they represented the value of a book. Like a cabinet of curiosities was one with fashions from 19th century France. I mean, this little girl wasn't interested, but it was precious. So on to the next stage, and this is Judith. And Judith had agency. This is the chapter about children who somehow got the opportunity to seek out books. And she lived at the bottom of Ecclesall Road in Pomona Street, big, dark, cold house, granny in the house, who was obviously quite a child, and very withdrawn father with some money, but her mother was really under the cosh. And her mother took her to the Tuppenny Library. I don't know if you ever heard of Tuppenny Libraries, but another source of great fascination because it was the source of romances, westerns, and funny books. So one of you's got a copy of Just William. And one of the surprises to me, I mean, I don't come from Sheffield, as you can probably tell, is I never expected that the two most popular authors in our selection were Just William and P.G. Wodehouse. And I mean, that fascinates me, especially since one of our interviewees, who is a communist, stated his favourite author was P.G. Wodehouse. And sadly, he's no longer with us. I can't ever tease this out, but he valued P.G. Wodehouse as a stylist, actually. He loved the way it was written. And of course, the world of P.G. Wodehouse is so remote from Sheffield that I think it was a kind of la-la land. And so there was no sense of they're posh, I'm not, or identification. It was just another world. And the same with Just William. So these books in the Tuppenny Libraries awaited people who had tuppence to borrow. And Judith's mum took her to the Tuppenny Library to get her romances. But she also walked her from the bottom of Ecclesall Road to the Central Library and enrolled her in the Central Library. And Judith, from the age of 7 onwards, would run from Pomona Street to the Central to get her books. But she didn't just run down the moor like we might. She skirted the moor because by 1942 and 3, she was younger than the children I've talked about before, it was rubble between Pomona Street and the Central. So she skirted the rubble. And the book that she found there absolutely fascinated me and showed just how potent a book can be at a certain point in your life. The book that she took out is called Joey and the Green Wings. Now, if anybody's heard of this, I will be astonished. I said in my book, it's not in children's histories. And a great friend of mine, of course, read my book 3 weeks ago and said, hang on, Mary, on eBay, there is this book. So this is happening now. Now the book is out. It is wonderful as it is being read because it is free to access. Liverpool University Press have it on a scheme called Open, so you can read it. And it's £16 to buy in paperback. So there's quite a saving there if you read it on open access and go to Liverpool University Press and you'll get it. But I looked up this book on eBay, I bought it and I read it about 2 weeks ago. And it was so interesting because remember, 1943, this book was published in 1942, and it's about elves that have been expelled from Earth because human beings don't believe in elves. They go up to an aerial land, and in this aerial land, they are invaded by fascist green wings, these kind of blue bottles with enormous wings. I know. And then, fortunately, a plucky little English boy called Dick, unsurprisingly, manages to get up onto this aerial land and rescue these elves from the blue bottles. He himself is then rescued by a plucky English airman who takes him back from the elven island back to Earth. So it's a very encouraging story about British pluck and about the power of a child to cope with fear and bombardment, invasion. So this book, even though it may not have survived in history, is worth a look. And I actually was able, last week when I had my launch, to give the copy I bought to Judith, which was a great delight. And she was one of the most proactive, resourceful readers I think we came across, but every single one of them was, in fact. And the desire to get your hands on a book created that resourcefulness. So just the next chapter, if I may, which is called Hefty Books and Twopenny Weeklies. And I talk about the comics in that because comics are absolute source, especially if you went to the tubercular hospital. You got free comics. And two of the people I've interviewed have got to be, one of them, actually I did an interview but read about, became a reader because he got tuberculosis. He went from the manor where he couldn't read into the hospital in Nether Edge, and he read comics, became a reader. And Frank there is also an example of that. He started on comics, but his mother is an example of how important occupation is in a era. His father was a conservative miner who actually believed that you should get out of mining and do it by reading. He didn't know what you should read, but you should read. Been in service. And when the Sheffield Libraries opened, it was very striking that a lot of the people who first signed up to Sheffield Libraries in the 1850s were in service. Mary Walton talked about quite surprised. But Mrs. Bergin, she was actually quite a fearsome woman. Frank was her only child, and she was very ambitious for him, but he failed the 11 plus, as pretty well so many people did who went on to do great things. Frank is the only interviewee we had who got PhD. Failed his 11 plus, but he went into Laycock's engineering. And if you were a boy, of course, and you got a good apprenticeship, you did get evening classes. None of our women readers who failed their 11 plus got that educational opportunity through evening classes. Frank took it and ran, partly because his mother and father's sort of voices in his ears. So he was an example of, in a way, the advantage that men had over women at actually accessing education late, but women also got their chance in the 60s, as we'll see. And the other thing I talk about in this book is the importance of the type of book that you borrow if you're a child on your own. Because if you walk from Attercliffe to, from Darnall to Attercliffe Free Library, as James Green did, you wanted a big book to take home. It was a long walk. So they never went for little, you know how our children have little slippery books. You didn't want that. You wanted a great big hefty book. So poor old James, he got Dr. Dolittle when he first went there, and he got it home and he found it was nearly all pictures. So he then walked back that same day to Attercliffe, and he found that he could only get out one book a day. So he walked all the way back. But in future, he took books. So that chapter, I talk about the kind of books that kids wanted to lay their hands on. So perhaps the chapter, how am I off for time? Just in
your own time.
Really, sure. So the next chapter, I move on to education. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. Reading networks, and this again is matter for more study. Which of our readers were part of reading networks? So few, but some were. The communists, for example, had a sort of link with other families and other organizations. The Methodists did. So one of my readers was from a Methodist family with lots of visiting preachers. And his treasured book was a hymn book, because he said, again, a hefty book. And in the hymn book, you've got lots of stories. So it became a kind of encyclopedia of stories, the hymn book, which I'd never thought of it as being. And then this young man, David Flather, came from quite a different background. I don't know if any of you come across Flathers and Sons, very, very big steel dynasty. And David's father owned a steel. He lived in a very large house out in Retford. And David was orphaned when he was 4. His mother died. And his father had a lot of cares, and he remarried twice, 2 stepmothers, who took no interest in David at all, except as a book carrier. So in Retford, little David, from quite an early age, was sent to the Boots Municipal Library. Have any of you come across Boots libraries? Yeah. They, again, like Twopenny libraries, are a network, a potential sort of resource, but only for those who could afford the subscription. So it tended to play on that middle class kind of kudos. And so what little David did, he went in with a list of books his stepmom wanted, and he gave the list to the librarian, got the books, and carried them back to the mansion. And he only started to read books of his choice, really, when he moved into Ecclesall to stay with relatives in Ecclesall, and he used Wheatwood as what became Ecclesall Library. So he became a passionate reader of fiction, and he was sent to boarding school at 4. So reading was a resource, a consolation. And so he loved popular fiction, which was a consoling type. And he went into technical writing for Edgar Allan. And he was a good wordsmith. And I knew David before I interviewed him. And he was so open to everything. And I think this characteristic is common to all the people we interview. Not one of those 65 people say, oh, I'd never read that. Oh, that was pretentious, or that was low, or they just hadn't got that set of. So that was a great consolation to me as an academic when I've been looking at all this nasty hierarchical attitude to reading in the 30s and 40s. None of the 65 of our interviewees were at all hierarchical. They never sneered. In fact, one of them, when I said, did you ever think something, he said, oh no, that's him. He said, he reads that, that's him. It's not me, but it's him. And that was true of David as well, even though he'd been to public schools and all that. So what the network did to how you read was subject to that chapter, and it opens up endless opportunities to research. I hope somebody will carry forward. And then the next chapter, chapter 5, is about education and the effect on books, which as an ex-comprehensive teacher is a bit dismal to me. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for the fact that I was trying to encourage people to read in their teens, I suppose. At 13, most of my students didn't want to read anything. Life was too exciting and testing, really. But schools haven't been brilliant at getting people to read widely. And it's partly the education system. And there was a golden moment in the 20s when there were a few educationally progressive primary schools in Sheffield. Up at Wisewood, there was one. And the children adored those schools. And they never became, the two ones I interviewed from that period, they didn't become readers, but they loved drama. And they weren't frightened of books, and they loved the word, they loved learning poetry. So they didn't get their school certificates, they left at elementary school 14, but they loved the word, so, and imagination. This lovely lady has only just died, Shirley Ellens, and she was got a very top grammar school place, and she got to high stores, and she did very well. And the people who did well in that sort of background usually became teachers. So it was so common. And actually, one of the interesting things is that few of the men did. For women, it was much more of a sort of something to be aspired to, I would say. And then the 6th chapter, I look at war and marriage. And I based a lot of it on this extraordinary material that was shared with me, which was the confession book of Mary Wilkinson. Does anybody know Frances Saw? Because she's active in sort of heritage circles. She's her daughter, and she produced for me this wonderful confession book that Mary compiled when she was 16. Her father was a printer, went bankrupt when the council stopped using his firm to publish their books. She became a secretary, and then she went to dancing classes. Her loving elder brothers paid for her to go to dancing classes in Salter Lane, and she wanted to sort of make friends. So she had a confession book, and in that confession book, every boy and girl put their favourite band, their favourite book. So I was able to tell from 52 entries what that cohort of teenagers was reading in 1937-8. So that was magic. And then Mary went on to compile her own reading diary in meticulous detail. So I have all the books she read from 1937 to 1943 when she married her father's lodger, who came with a whole set of Rudyard Kipling's in his bag. So she became a Rudyard Kipling fan. So again, the serendipitous of these sort of relatively sort of, if you like, unhighly educated but very intelligent people's lives is fascinating. Then the last chapter, I think it's the last chapter. Oh no, it's about courtship and marriage and what marriage does to the way you read. And sometimes it's disastrous because your husband doesn't care for your reading, or your wife wants you to do something else all the time. But in these cases, Doreen Gill, her husband was loved messing around with machinery. He messed around with machinery. She read novels. Magic. Happy, happy time. But I won't dwell on that. And then the last chapter, I think, chapter 8, yes, is actually not chronological. It's taking a theme, which is what happens when you get an education where your reading is hierarchical, when you are told that Anna Karenina is the thing to read. Or in Julia Banks' case, you go to teach training class, and I said, what did you read there? At the college. And she said, oh, well, Anna Karenina, all the usual things. Now, that fascinated me because, for whom is Anna Karenina the usual sort of thing? Only somebody who has probably got a family who's thought that, or into a higher education establishment. Grammar school, they didn't say Anna Karenina is what you should be reading. So Julia I just ended her, but I write a lot about her in that chapter because she never knew her father. Her mother was a corsetier in Woodhouse, and she went to the grammar school there. Now, what was unusual about Woodhouse was the grammar school was on the doorstep of a lot of people who hadn't got access to libraries usually, but in Woodhouse there was both a grammar school and a library, and that combination was key. It meant that kids could actually explore books on their own, but they also got an education. Whereas a lot of people didn't go to grammar school because they couldn't face what James called the solo run, actually putting on your uniform in Attercliffe and then going up to high stores across the city in that uniform, marked you out. And people often pulled out their grammar school place because they just couldn't face it. But in Woodhouse, that problem didn't exist because there was the grammar school, and Julia took advantage of that. She became a teacher as well. So my tiny little last chapter was just to say how glad I was that, having done this project, so much of my anger about people like myself in the 30s and 40s who despised readers, well, didn't affect these readers at all. They never felt despised. They never felt guilty. They felt absolutely confident in their reading. They may not have felt confident in their jobs because a lot of them didn't have the education they could have used, but they were never apologetic about their reading, and they never made anybody else feel ashamed. So it was a great experience to do the project. And if you want to read it, I've got a few books here, but it's free online. So thanks for asking me, Robin.
Well, thank you very much.